Today we're diving into one of the most exciting intersections in desktop computing, the convergence of Android and Linux. For years, Windows has dominated as the default operating system for everyday computing tasks. But in recent years, alternative approaches have emerged that challenge traditional desktop paradigms, especially options that blend the worlds of Android apps and Linux flexibility. Some enthusiasts and power users even ask whether these platforms could one day replace a traditional Windows PC for everyday use. Let's start by setting the stage with some context. Windows represents a decades-old ecosystem designed primarily around x86 architecture, traditional desktop applications, deep hardware support, and a massive software library. But it's not without its criticisms, performance overhead, licensing costs, mandatory updates, and sometimes bloat. Linux, meanwhile, offers a free, open-source alternative with immense flexibility, a vast developer community, and nearly endless customization. But it historically suffered from software compatibility issues for mainstream consumer applications. Android itself, a Linux derivative at its core, dominates mobile computing with an app ecosystem optimized for touch. The idea then, what if you could combine the strengths of Linux and Android into a hybrid platform? A system that runs Android apps seamlessly like you might on a phone or a tablet while maintaining the freedom, flexibility, and hardware support of desktop Linux. That concept has given rise to projects like Chromium OS, Android emulation layers. FydeOS is a unique take on a Linux-Android hybrid, originally based on Chromium. FydeOS aims to bring the browser-centric simplicity and Android app support to a wide range of hardware. It's essentially an operating system built around Chrome-like environment that also supports Android applications through native integration. FydeOS supports both Android APKs and Linux apps through containers, and it's designed to run on desktops and laptops with a more seamless experience. On the other hand, Waydroid takes a different approach. Rather than a full operating system built from the ground up, Waydroid functions as a containerized Android environment that runs on top of a Linux distribution. As a result, Waydroid excels at performance and integration while relying on the host Linux system for desktop capabilities. Before we dive deeper into comparative analysis, let's talk about the core philosophies behind both projects. FydeOS's vision is more holistic, provide an all-in-one operating system that supports web apps, Android apps, and Linux programs wrapped in a cohesive user experience that could theoretically serve as the primary interface for everyday computing. By contrast, Waydroid is built with a modular mindset. Waydroid's core motivation is to bridge the app gap, enabling the software ecosystem of mobile Android to coexist with the flexibility of desktop Linux. Now let's unpack how each system actually works. Starting with FydeOS, at its core, FydeOS is a fork of Chromium OS, the open source project behind Chrome OS. When you first boot into FydeOS, the environment will look familiar if you've ever used a Chromebook. There's a taskbar or shelf, a launcher for apps, and a focus on web applications reflecting its Chrome heritage. But FydeOS extends beyond pure web-centric computing. It incorporates support for Android applications through containerization technologies, similar to how Chrome OS runs Android apps. Depending on the build and hardware, FydeOS can run Android APKs directly. This means you can install and launch Android apps much like on a traditional Android device. The Android subsystem is integrated into the window management system so that Android apps appear alongside web and Linux applications, with support for resizable windows and keyboard mouse input. In terms of Linux support, FydeOS implements something akin to a containerized Linux environment. This allows traditional open source software to be installed and run. This integration is compelling because it theoretically eliminates the need to dual boot or switch between different operating systems. However, it's important to understand that because it's built from the ground up, as its own OS hardware support and driver compatibility are dependent on community contributions and upstream Chromium OS support. In short, FydeOS aspires to be a universal operating system, but its practical compatibility is evolving. Waydroid approaches this from a different angle. Waydroid is not a standalone OS. It's a container system that runs Android inside a Linux host. Think of it as Android in a box, but one with full access to hardware acceleration and system resources. Unlike traditional emulators that virtualize hardware and incur performance overhead, Waydroid uses Linux container technologies such as LXC or similar tools to run Android directly on the host kernel. Because no heavy virtualization layer exists, Android apps run with near-native performance. Waydroid also integrates more deeply with the Linux desktop environment. Android windows appear alongside native Linux applications, and input devices are mapped seamlessly. The Android environment interacts with the host SE file system, meaning you can share files between Linux and Android apps. However, Waydroid depends on the host distribution for things like display servers, input stack, and system services. It doesn't provide a complete desktop interface by itself. It piggybacks on your existing Linux environment. With that basic understanding, let's compare how these systems fare in terms of installation and setup. FydeOS is installed as its own operating system and go through an installation process similar to installing Chrome OS or Linux, depending on your hardware. This may be straightforward or require custom builds. For some devices, especially older laptops or SBCs like Raspberry Pi, a community port of FydeOS may be available, but you need to be comfortable with system installation, potentially flashing firmware, or debugging driver issues. Waydroid, on the other hand, is added to an existing Linux system. If you're already running Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, or any supported distro, you can install Waydroid packages, enable its container system, and start Android apps. For mainstream distributions, installation guides are relatively abundant. Still, it's not a click-and-play experience like installing an app. It requires command line usage and sometimes kernel tweaking. Now let's talk about user experience. Once everything is up and running, FydeOS presents users with a desktop environment that's intentionally simplified. You get a launcher, a taskbar, a settings panel, and windowed apps. Android apps launch in Windows, some support full screen, and you can resize them. Because it's an OS level feature, the integration feels natural. You can use Android apps with a keyboard and mouse, and some Android apps even adapt their UI to larger screens. Web apps through the Chrome-like browser are perhaps the most seamless. What is particularly appealing about FydeOS is that the user doesn't have to think about environments. Everything exists within one unified system. If you're someone who loves tweaking system internals, adjusting window managers, or customizing every aspect of your desktop, the FydeOS environment might feel limiting. Waydroid's experience is different because you're running Android inside a Linux desktop. Depending on your desktop environment, Gnome, KD, Plasma, XSC, or something else, Waydroid windows behave like native apps. Sometimes there are quirks. Window decorations may differ, and resizing Android apps that aren't designed for large screens can lead to odd layouts. And media apps run smoothly because the Android system leverages containerized access to hardware acceleration. System notifications from Android apps may integrate with your Linux notification system depending on configuration, and file sharing between environments makes working across both ecosystems fluid. Now, let's consider app compatibility, which is a major factor if you're contemplating replacing a Windows PC. Windows has an enormous software library, everything from Microsoft Office, Adobe Creative Suite, AAA games, and specialized professional applications. Neither FydeOS nor Waydroid directly competes with that. However, both offer access to Android's ecosystem, which includes millions of apps on the Play Store or third-party apps. For everyday tasks, email, messaging, social media, productivity tools like Google Docs, entertainment apps like Netflix, and casual gaming, Android apps can often deliver comparable functionality. FydeOS can run many Android apps natively, though compatibility varies depending on integration quality and whether the app expects a touchscreen. Waydroid similarly supports vast Android software, often with excellent performance. That said, productivity apps that assume a keyboard and mouse sometimes behave unpredictably in an Android environment. And for professional or specialized desktop software CAD programs, video editing, suites, engineering applications, there are a few viable Android alternatives that match the depth of full desktop software. Linux apps help fill some gaps on both platforms. FydeOS provides Linux container support, but it's important to be pragmatic. Neither system can run native Windows applications out of the box. You can install compatibility layers like Wine or Proton in Linux, but performance and compatibility vary widely. Another critical factor is performance and resource usage. Windows is designed with x86 hardware in mind, and modern versions optimize for multi-core CPUs, integrated and discrete G and large amounts of RAM. But Windows also consumes significant resources just to provide its environment, leading to performance overhead on lower-end hardware. It boots quickly, uses less RAM for the core system, and because Android apps are containerized, resource usage can be efficient. For example, Android games that would struggle under traditional emulators like BlueStacks often perform smoothly under Waydroid. The catch is that both systems depend on hardware support for GPU acceleration and drivers. Without proper support, performance can degrade. Battery life and power management are also worth considering. Windows has matured power management over many years, optimizing for a range of hardware. FydeOS, similarly to Chrome OS, is efficient when idle and optimized for web and Android workloads. Containers typically consume predictable resources, but Android processes running in the background can influence overall battery usage. Each solution then has strengths depending on device and workload. Windows has robust security mechanisms, but its broad install base makes it a frequent target for malware and exploits. Provides a smaller attack surface and sandboxed execution for Android and web apps. But security is only as strong as update frequency and system maintenance. Hardware compatibility remains a practical constraint. Windows typically supports the widest range of hardware, particularly peripherals and specialized components. For many modern devices, Wi-Fi, display, and basic drivers work out of the box. But peripherals may require manual configuration or lack support entirely. But if Linux struggles to support something, for instance, proprietary Wi-Fi chips or specialized audio interfaces, Waydroid can't resolve that. For a segment of users, especially those whose primary workflows consist of web browsing, email, messaging, media consumption, light productivity, and Android apps, both FydeOS and Waydroid can provide compelling alternatives. FydeOS's all-in-one operating system approach offers simplicity for users who want a cohesive environment without installing a separate Linux distribution. This means you keep all the Linux tools you rely on and gain Android compatibility without compromising performance. They can't run native Windows applications with the same compatibility or performance. And though workarounds exist, they're not seamless for all use cases. And cross-platform ecosystems suggest that traditional boundaries between mobile and desktop will continue to blur. Better support for x86 and ARM architectures, and broader hardware compatibility. Projects like Proton and Wine continue to bridge compatibility gaps for Windows apps on Linux, and containerization improves performance for alternative environments. In conclusion, FydeOS and Waydroid each represent fascinating steps toward a hybrid computing paradigm. Linux and web apps into a single OS, ideal for straightforward computing tasks and users who want simplicity. Waydroid brings high-performance Android integration to existing Linux systems. Neither is a complete Windows replacement for all scenarios today, but both offer valuable alternatives for specific workflows and user profiles. If your computing needs are centered around productivity, communication, entertainment, and light application usage, either could serve as your daily driver with the right hardware and expectations. As technology evolves, these hybrid platforms may continue narrowing the gap with traditional desktop operating systems.